You're listening to the Parents of Hardworking Teens podcast, episode 103, where we're going to get into what impresses teachers and gets marks in years 7 and 8, and how this changes as your teen moves up through the year groups. Because what gold stars and great feedback in those early years of high school evolves significantly in terms of performance as they move through years 9 and 10 and then into those senior years. So stay tuned to find out what changes and in what ways so your teen can evolve their focus, effort, and time spent on different aspects of their study to match what gets rewarded. I'm Katie Jones, and with over 15 years in education as an award-winning high school teacher, international external examiner, and as a study coach, I've helped thousands of students skyrocket their results and confidence. And this podcast is where I share all my insights, tactics, and tips with you, the parent, so you can help your hardworking teen get happy, smart, and successful in their study, and have you both enjoy the journey along the way. This is the Parents of Hardworking Teens podcast. Hey VIPs, how are you? I hope you're doing great. I am doing fantastically because I am recording this just a few days after the Exam Success Secrets webinar. And it was amazing. It was huge. We had a huge number of attendees and we did a huge Q&A at the end. It ended up being a total marathon session, but it was fantastic. We covered so much. Now, by the time this episode is actually released, the recording of the webinar will have been taken down. So if you missed it, or you're listening to this episode at a later date, but you'd like to be first to hear about these sorts of events that I run just a few times a year in future, then make sure you are on my email list, which you can get onto by requesting the free parent guide at www.rocksolidstudy.com/guide. Also, make sure to like or follow the Rock Solid Study page on Facebook and Instagram because I also post updates there. So let's dive in, and I'm going to start with a good old bit of compare and contrast. I'm going to compare and contrast the earlier years of high school with those upper or senior years in high school or college. So depending on where you are, I'm talking about years 7 and 8 or years 8 and 9 compared with years 11 and 12 or 12 and 13. So to be clear, that's ages of approximately 11 to 13 and then 16 to 18. So you can just apply this to whatever year groupings your school system uses wherever you are listening from. Now, I focus most of my work and training today on students in years 9 to 12 or 10 to 13. And this issue that we're going to discuss here on the podcast right now is actually indirectly one reason for that year group focus, because by the time students are in year 9 onwards, we're basically having to undo quite a lot of ways that they have been trained, in inverted commas, trained to study and perform in their assessments, in their schoolwork, because at a very basic level, they have been commended and acknowledged and rewarded in those earlier high school years for things like researching loads of facts and information for inquiry investigations or research projects, for going over and above, doing more than is asked for in assignments, and for putting in lots and lots of time and effort into things like the presentation of their work, a fancy front cover, maybe some singing and dancing graphics on their PowerPoint presentation, whatever it might be. Now, I will say I totally did this as a student who wanted to do well and wanted their work to look good. I very clearly remember feeling extremely sophisticated and accomplished for giving in a coursework project in high school that had a laminated front cover. Back then, a laminated page was like the height of professionalism. You couldn't just buy a laminator as a layperson, and we didn't have things like Officeworks or other services that just anyone could go and use. But my best friend at the time, Lorraine, Her mum was a teaching assistant and I think also did some of the office work at the local primary school. So we would give her our front covers and she would sneakily laminate them during the day for us at work. Now, of course, I will also say these front covers were where we had hand-drawn with bubble writing for the title. Goodness knows what the visuals were like. I can't even remember. It was definitely done on pastel coloured paper, which, come to think of it, was probably also supplied by Lorraine's mum. It's okay. She's retired. I don't think this revelation is going to get her the sack. But I say all of this because I think it is, of course, great to encourage a good work ethic. That's definitely something that was instilled in me. And yes, first impressions do count when it is just the class teacher marking a project. We are not robots. And yes, it can be important to instill that character trait of taking pride in our work. But when students continue to do these things and put time and effort into these things in their senior years, and I'm not just talking about laminating a front cover, I'm going to give you more detail on what I'm talking about in a few moments, but it just means that they're not going to get any extra marks or credit or reward for them at those levels, and they could even start to count against them. And I'll go into more on that in a moment as well. Because honestly, we've really been subconsciously training students that these things are rewarded and are ways to succeed in their study. And I say that even for myself as a teacher. I have definitely realized that I have done that with students in those lower year groups as well. So it's no wonder that I still see students now spending time in those upper year groups, making really neat or pretty looking notes, having fancy front covers, spending ages on formatting, doing lots of unnecessary extra research. Now, they might not realize it's unnecessary, but when they go through my training or when I'm able to point this out to them on coaching calls, we realize it's not necessary. So if, for example, they've been asked to investigate the effects of volcanoes as a natural hazard, and in year 7, they also, within that project, decided to include the causes of those volcanoes, how they're created. They've put in lots of spectacular pictures or photos of volcanoes. Maybe they've gone in and dressed up as a volcano to present their findings. All of those things will likely have contributed to them getting a great result. Lots of praise from the teacher, an email home. Maybe they'll have even discovered that they have a passion for the natural world and for geography. And that part is great. But if they do that in year 12, let's say, then aside from having spent a ton of time and effort that wouldn't be called necessarily a waste if they have that passion and they love the subject, but won't be rewarded in the mark scheme, which most certainly will be focused only on effects of volcanoes as natural hazards, then they'll most likely be in for a much lower grade at the end of it, and possibly with that some disappointment and even confusion about why they came out with a lower than expected or hoped for grade. Now, I know that that is a very basic example, but hopefully you and your team can start to see how this might be creeping in some different ways, more discreet or subtle ways for your teen and their study as they move up through the year groups. Because these things that are taking up time and effort for students often make students feel like they're being productive and they've spent X amount of hours studying and put in this amount of effort. But like I said, in those higher year groups, it'll actually earn them very little to no credit or marks. And so what happens is students are subconsciously trained to do these in the lower year groups and then need to actively undo them and get retrained in the skills and actions and ways to produce quality assessments, or even just study more effectively and efficiently in the day-to-day, so that they're putting their time and effort and their hopes into things and ways of working that will get marks, will get reward and credit in those senior years. Because, spoiler alert, a fancy front cover is not going to get them an A in their personal research project. And bonus fact, correct but not asked for info will not get them more marks in their science exams. It simply will not appear on the marking criteria. So while the content is indeed getting harder and the expectations of what needs to be produced are higher, these often aren't the only reason that your teen's hard work is no longer paying off as well as it used to in those lower year groups. It's also, or perhaps to some extent instead, because the things that used to work are no longer working. They aren't needed, or they just don't really count for anything anymore. And the things that used to get them, those gold stars, smiley faces, big red ticks, great effort comments in their feedback, are now just not important, or they're not credited, because there is a lot less room for, and even I would say no room for, in those upper year groups and in external assessments or any assessments that count towards coursework, there's no room for discretionary marks in those stringent and official mark schemes. So the effort of going over and above is replaced by a need to be focused and succinct, which ironically is almost the opposite of going over and above. Now, this is where I mentioned earlier that sometimes the act of going over and above can actually count against your teen, because instead of being additional related information or seen as that way, it would now be considered as irrelevant information or detracting from their point, simply in the sense that it is off focus from what was asked for and therefore is detracting from the inquiry or the analysis, or is a distraction from the key message or theme that they need to be writing about and focusing on. So if you look at marking guides and success criteria in the higher year groups and those from exam boards, you'll see descriptors like clear and focused or discerning. And this means that staying on track and in line with exactly what's being asked for is part of what's being assessed, and bringing in extra information, alternative arguments or perspectives, if they are not asked for, they will bring that response down from being discerning and focused. When a response is discerning and focused, then information hasn't been included just in case, or because I found it and it looked good or it sounded smart. That is not focused or discerning. So it might be worth your teen having a think about, what did they used to get special mention for, or positive comments for, or great feedback on in their homework or classwork or assignments in the past? And are those the things that will still meet the success criteria and mark schemes in their senior years? Now, of course, it is important to reward a good work ethic. I'm not saying students shouldn't be rewarded for going over and above in those early years of high school, but we want to avoid it leading to overworking, spending time and effort on things that aren't going to count for much, things that aren't effective in those later years when the workload is much greater and they have a lot more going on in life, and will potentially lead to not just deflation or disappointment with their results, but also perhaps confusion that might come along with that. So a great question to consider is, how can that work ethic be gradually transferred to things that will pay off, that are required for top results? And therefore, your teen needs to build an awareness of what are those things that are now required for top results? What do those descriptors truly mean? How are these things changing gradually and subtly throughout their high school years? So this is just something to look out for, something to be aware of and conscious of as your teen moves through their schooling. I hope this is helpful. I hope you have a really great day, and I will see you back here on the next episode. Take care. Bye. If you're ready to have your teen achieve their best possible results with less stress, then I want to invite you to enroll them in the 10-week Grade Transformation Program, where they're going to learn the key concepts, skills, and strategies to catapult their performance in assessments and exams. It's risk-free. They either achieve bigger and better results with a whole lot more confidence in 10 weeks, or we refund you in full. Just head over to www.rocksolidstudy.com/program, and I'll see you there.